Shalom and welcome to Pearls of the Torah. I'm Moreh Matan, Pastor Matt McEwen, and I'm so glad to be joining you again this week as we dive into the Torah portion. This week we are in Parashat Lecha, and this is really where the Torah begins to make a turn, a shift, as we get into Genesis chapter 12 and we are introduced to really, if you think about it, the central figure of the Torah, in that Abraham is the father of everyone else who comes to us, not only through the rest of the Torah, but really the rest of the whole Bible. Even when we get into the Brit Chadashah, the New Testament, we are still looking at the Jewish Messiah and a son of Abraham, of Avraham Avinu. So it's really quite interesting. Once we hit Genesis chapter 12, then everything changes. So this Torah portion is quite important. We see here, it is called Lecha. The word Lech means to go. And when we have this repetition of Lecha, it means go for yourself or go for your own good. And this is something that is central to this Torah portion, the idea of it being for Abraham's benefit that he goes. Of course, he's known at this time as Avram or Abram, and it's not until later that God changes his name. So I think we could probably title our thoughts today as Trust, Obedience, and the Covenant and Journey of Faith. Obviously, as we look into Hebrews chapter 11, the chapter of faith, we see that Abraham is a central figure there as well. So the scripture for us this week is Genesis chapter 12, beginning at verse 1 through chapter 17, verse 27. And again, the themes of this are divine calling, faith, covenant, trust, and blessing. Now, as we look into this divine call to go forth for yourself, here is what the scripture says in English in verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you." Now, as this year we are going through the commentary by the Or HaChaim, this particular Jewish commentary is meaningful to us as we are going through the Or HaChaim's thoughts, and he says that Lech Lecha, this command, is seen as both a literal call to physically leave and also a spiritual invitation to grow closer to God. Remember, according to Jewish tradition, it was even before Abram's call that he knew that there was one true God. In fact, as we look into the Tanya and other Jewish commentaries and works, we see that several rabbis believe that he was just 3 years old when he realized that there was one true God. So we see on two levels here, on two planes at the same time, if you will, the physical call to leave your country and also the spiritual invitation to grow closer to God. So the Or HaChaim interprets the phrase Lech Lecha, as I've already mentioned, as go for yourself, go for your own good, for your own benefit, meaning that this journey is for Abram's ultimate benefit, which leads him to spiritual fulfillment and blessings. Now, something that we must ask ourselves today, and that is, how does leaving behind something familiar, comfort and security, for instance, how does this relate to growth in faith? How does leaving comfort and security lead us to growth in faith? Why might God ask us to step out into the unknown? Now, I know it would be very easy for us to answer this question in a general sense. Well, because when we do that, when we step into the unknown, we focus more on God and we depend more on Him, on His providence, on His sovereignty, on His provision, on His protection. That is an easy answer to give. What does it look like in our personal lives? That is the more difficult question. What would it look like if God asked us to leave our security and our safety, our comfort behind? It's a very interesting question. Now, we could think about areas in our lives where God might be calling us away from safety, security, and comfort and into more faith and trusting God more deeply. This is something that God may be asking us to do. Are we willing to do it? Are we willing to Lecha, as it were? Let's look at God's promise of blessing and influence. What he says there in chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 is, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Now, the Or HaChaim notes that these blessings are layered. They include personal greatness, protection, and influence over others. He emphasizes that Abram is not merely promised blessings, but is called to be a conduit of blessings to the world. Abram's greatness comes not only from wealth or status, but from his relationship with God and his role in spreading God's name. Remember, God says that through Abraham, the nations of the world will be blessed. And as Rabbi Shapira has many times pointed this out to us, not the least of which in the place of his book called The Besorah According to COVID-19. And just off the top of my head, because I taught on this recently, it's around between pages 403 and 410, somewhere in there. We see a wonderful graphic on one of those pages that compares the word Baruch, or the word blessed, to the word bricha, which literally means to engraft a branch of one tree into another tree. So that we could actually translate this verse, that through you all of the nations of the world will be grafted, will be engrafted. And that's exactly the ultimate goal, is for us to be engrafted into the house of Israel because of Abraham being the father of faith and us entering into this covenant of faith. Again, referencing Hebrews chapter 11 there. So, what does it mean to be a blessing to others? And if we take this to the next logical step with the word bricha, how can we help engraft others into the house of Israel by being a blessing to them? That is something that I think we need to discuss. And probably we need to bring up, since I've already brought up the Besorah according to COVID-19, this comes from the section, chapter 8 in that book called The Coronavirus and the Two Brides. In that section, Rabbi Shapira talks about how there are certain rabbis that say that Israel needs to be engrafted back into their place, into their rightful place. That it's not only the nations that need to be grafted, but that Israel must be re-engrafted, as it were. And that being the case, how do we, as we bless Israel, as we bless not only the nation of Israel, the physical nation, but the house of Israel, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, how do we, in blessing them, as we do the act of Baruch, of blessing them, how do we make sure that there is this bricha, this engrafting? And that is something that is a provocative thought for us. And maybe it will spur us on to do that kind of thing. Now, how do these blessings, another question for us, how do these blessings connect with God's mission for Abram and his descendants? Think of ways that you can be a practical blessing in your daily life to those around you. And how can you, in being a blessing, how can the act of you being a blessing to those around you, through acts of kindness, of sharing your faith, serving others, these types of things, how can that lead to an engrafting, not just a blessing? Let's look now at Abram's test of faith in Egypt. It says there in verse 10, Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. Isn't it interesting? It happens multiple times where the Abraham or his descendants go down into Egypt because of some tragedy, because of some bad thing that happens. A famine in Abram's case, being sold into slavery in Joseph's case. The famine in the case of Joseph's brothers, later Jacob and the rest of the family. It's really quite interesting. Now, the Or HaChaim suggests that Abraham's decision to go to Egypt was part of a divine test. You know, it is said that Abram, later Abraham, went through 10 tests. And some of them had to do with the occasion of the almost sacrifice of his son Isaac. Despite being promised blessings, Abraham faces hardship almost immediately upon entering the promised land. And this challenge illustrates that God's promises may involve trials that test one's commitment and trust. And also, it underscores God's promise may seem to us, from a human perspective, as taking a long time to be fulfilled. But remember, even in the Brit Chadashah, we have this scripture about God is not slow as we perceive slowness in fulfilling his promise. So let's ask ourselves this next question. Why would God allow Abram to experience hardship after calling him? And especially after Abraham's obedience, after he does what God asks and goes to this other place, why does God allow him to then immediately go through a hardship, which has him go to a different place, which is not the place that God called him? Another question along with that: how does faith grow through testing? Again, that seems obvious and self-evident. It just seems like one naturally happens because of the other. Testing makes our faith grow. But it really isn't always the case. We really see that there can be two extremes in this regard. That there can be a real increase of faith because of testing, but also we can give in to our human weakness and we can give up on faith because of testing. I've seen it in my own circle of friends and loved ones that when a hardship comes, your faith is either really strengthened or you are tempted to turn your back on it. It's really that extreme. It rarely is something in the middle. I want you to reflect on personal challenges that you have had and how they may serve as tests of faith. You know, sometimes when something happens to us that is tragic or difficult, we often automatically default to viewing that as an attack from the enemy, when really it could be a testing of our faith that God is allowing us or commanding us to go through. And of course, as we see in the narrative of Job, these two are not mutually exclusive. That it is an attack, but it's because God is testing the faith. It's really quite interesting. Also, think of a specific trial that led to spiritual growth or new insights into God's character. Think about that. The covenant of circumcision. So in Genesis 17:10, it says, "This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you. The covenant you are to keep, every male among you shall be circumcised." Now the Or HaChaim describes circumcision as both a physical and spiritual act. Of course, Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, and many others in our tradition would agree with that. And to say that really the physical act of circumcision really only benefits you if you have had a spiritual circumcision. Paul even goes so far as to say, who is truly Jewish, who is truly Israel, Is it someone who has had a physical surgery but does not have the circumcision of the heart? Or is it someone, I think the wording in English is, one is not a Jew that is only a Jew outwardly. So just because someone is Jewish and they have become circumcised in their flesh doesn't necessarily mean that the heart has been circumcised. This is really quite an interesting thing. Now remember, Testament is often used as a stand-in for the concept of conversion, because it is part of the conversion process for males converting to Judaism. So a lot of times the phrase or the word circumcision can be a stand-in for or a synonym for conversion. So it is interesting that as we talk about a circumcision of the heart, we can talk about how we, in our conversion of the heart, that there's no need to go through a physical conversion if you are a Gentile believer in the Jewish Messiah, but rather there is a conversion of the heart. There's something that happens at the heart level and at the will level, that the kavanah, the intent of the heart, is pure in wanting to follow Israel as our older brother, if you will. Now, what is interesting here is we can reflect on the physical sign of the covenant and what it says about the relationship between physical actions and spiritual commitments. Now, if you're like me and you grew up in the church, no doubt you experienced some form of baptism. And in Christianity, we often like to say that baptism is simply an outward sign of an inward commitment. The same is true with circumcision. Do your spiritual commitments affect what you do physically? It's a good question. Let's think of ways in our modern world that we can dedicate ourselves to God and demonstrate our covenant with Him through intentional actions and personal commitments. I think this is a beautiful idea. Let's look at faith and promises, Abraham's patience and God's timing. In Genesis 15:5, it says, He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Now the Or HaChaim reflects on God's promise of countless descendants as an invitation for Abraham to trust God to do the impossible. Despite old age and the lack of an heir, Abraham's faith in God's promise becomes a central aspect of his relationship with God. This is why, when it comes down to it, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, when it really comes down to it, and we'll get to that in the coming weeks, when it comes down to the sacrifice of Isaac, when Abraham says, the boy and I will go worship and then we will come back to you, he says we deliberately, because he knows that even if God really asks him to go through with it and kill his own son, that somehow God will resurrect him. Because after all, it is through Isaac that the promise is going to be fulfilled. And God is faithful in fulfilling his promise. He's not a man that he should lie. So the faith that Abraham has, that even if he dies, well, then God must be able to bring him back, because he's the promised child through which, these descendants are going to come. Now, let's look at some practical takeaways. Let's have trust in God's call. Following God often requires leaving behind comfort and familiarity, even safety and security, trusting that He leads us to a greater purpose. This is important. Number 2, focus on being a blessing. Like Abraham, we are called to be a blessing to those around us, reflecting God's love and faithfulness. And don't forget the coming together of these two concepts of Baruch and Bricha, of blessing and engrafting. Number 3, faith through testing. God's promises do not exempt us from trials. Instead, these challenges serve to strengthen our relationship with Him. Number 4, a visible commitment. Spiritual commitments can be symbolized through physical actions, reminding us of our covenant with God. And finally, patience with God's timing. God's promises come in His timing, not ours, requiring faith in what may seem impossible. Now, I think the Or HaChaim has given us lots to think about this week in Parashat Lecha. And I pray that this teaching has been a blessing to you and maybe made you think of things in a bit of a different way. Take this different perspective and start to live out some of these things in your life, in the world around you, and in the people that you encounter, knowing that your being a blessing to them may be the catalyst that allows for their engrafting into the house of Israel. Thank you so much for joining me. Once again, I am Pastor Matt McEwen, Moreh Matan with Ahavat Ami International. It's my joy to be with you every single week. If you have not subscribed to this channel already, please do so, and please share this teaching on your social media so that as many people as possible can benefit and be blessed, and maybe even become grafted because of it. Thank you so much. An early Shabbat Shalom to you this week, no matter where you are in the world. And as always, may the Lord bless you and keep you. And may you bless others as the Lord blesses you.